So I'd like to welcome y'all to our breakout session. Hopefully y'all found the meeting helpful and informative. I think that first time I attended one of these meetings, I think was 4 years ago, it's like I was amazed at how much information that was provided in a short amount of time, and hopefully y'all you really find that helpful. My name is Gerald Goldstein. I'm the medical director for Fertility Specialists of Texas. We are located here in Dallas. Our main office is actually in Frisco. And we also have an office in Dallas, and we have one in South Lake. There's my email address. Certainly if y'all have any questions or want to email me, feel free to take a picture of that, or we can have that on our cards. Here you go. So it's in our folders. So we have 4 physicians that are part of our practice. Again, like I said, we have 3 offices here. We did last year about 550 IVF cycles, which is what we're talking about in terms of. So we do a fair amount of volume. We have 3 on-site embryologists. We have. I would say one of the things that makes us different that has helped us a lot is that we have an excellent lab. And the lab has allowed us to have success rates that really are above the national average, and has made it where for most of our patients are able to get pregnant really the first time in terms of going through, which makes a difference. So why would you consider, there's a lot of different fertility practices. What makes us different? Well, one is, like I said, we have excellent success rates. We have an in-house egg donor program. It's certainly not anywhere as big as like typically a lot of other egg donor programs, because our primary job is really making babies. But we do have an in-house egg donor program. Financially, Texas is an affordable state, but we also participate in the GPAT program with men having babies, doing 2 pro bono cases a year. We work with surrogacy agencies that are able to quickly find surrogates for you, and that are very well aware of how things can be, like, for example, of finding surrogates that are willing to work with 2 guys. We have guaranteed programs, and we have guaranteed programs in terms of success rates, because we have guaranteed programs because we really have good success rates. And so if that's something you're interested in, you can certainly speak with Ashley about that. We sponsor programs here in Dallas and even nationally regarding surrogacy. So what's involved in terms of, I know you, for example, if you've been thinking about this process, how do you really get started? Well, it really starts off with coming to an event such as this, and then we typically would want to see you. We could, for example, if you're not local, there are patients that we've actually, like, for example, from New York and places like that, where we've Skyped with initially before they kind of decide whether they really want to go to come see us. But we would sit down eventually in our office and just kind of review the process of making a baby. So we would review the process in terms of, from your perspective, we would want to. When you come in, we kind of go through your history. We typically would have you freeze sperm your first visit. We do blood testing, make sure that that allows us to freeze the sperm. And y'all probably know this is all regulated by the FDA, Food and Drug Administration. We have you meet members of our team, like Whitney, for example, and Ashley, who would who would be the people that you would be talking with really daily or weekly in terms of how things are progressing. When you're talking about using an egg donor in gestational care, there are a lot of different moving parts, and that involves your endocrinologist, your reproductive endocrinologist, the embryologist, in terms of how, for example, once your egg donor goes through and we get eggs, how those embryos are progressing, how many embryos you ultimately have that are being biopsied. Third party, which is a separate, which is like, for example, we have Whitney works in third party, as well as 3 other individuals that would be able to help you and keep you up to date. And it's also like our, financing, which is really an important part of the process as well. Typically, this is, different ways of, it starts off with, for example, y'all of seeing you, referring you to reproductive endocrinologist, which is us, a surrogacy agency, just because you want to be also at the same time. We typically divide it up into making the embryos, freezing the embryos, and then the second part is just transferring those embryos into a surrogate. So while we may initially see you and then start the process of making the embryos, we also want you to kind of be in touch with the surrogacy agency, or at least somehow in terms of who's going to actually be carrying the pregnancy, because ultimately, it's about making a baby. Again, we have our in-house egg donor program. There's no agency fee. They're local donors as opposed to having donors that are all over the country, and they're pre-screened. So there are benefits of that, but we do not have I would say that we certainly don't have as wide of a selection as agency donors. For example, like I said, if you're looking for someone that's like 6'2" and has like a SAT score of 1,600, we may not have that person. The process, just in general, is basically seeing the egg donor, doing their screening, and then placing her on medications that are medications that stimulate her ovaries to produce eggs. Typically, females release one egg a month. When you're going through this process, we want them that produce multiple eggs, and so they're placed on medications to stimulate their ovaries. The average number of eggs that we get are 17. The range can be anywhere between 10 to 25. Here you can see where we aspirate the eggs transvaginally. You can see with this picture on the right, fertilize the eggs, where you take a single sperm and inject it inside the egg to make an embryo. And then that's a picture of day 5 embryos of like tons of embryos, which are really very, very nice embryos. In the lab is where the IVF lab is where they combine the sperm and the egg, inject a single sperm inside of the egg, and then the embryologist would provide you updates in terms of how that is proceeding. After you make the embryos, the next part is seeing the surrogate, like we talked about, doing the screening for the surrogate, and then actually getting her prepared to do the embryo transfer. And that basically involves placing her on medications to make her uterus to be very receptive. And finally, the day of actually transferring the embryos, which is usually when y'all are in our office, give you a picture of the embryos like what you saw on the previous slide, and then taking 1 or 2 embryos and this very carefully placing them inside of her uterus. And that day she basically lays flat. The next day she can really do whatever she wants, and then 10 days later do a pregnancy test. So what are the factors that impact success? One is the quality of the egg and the sperm. I can tell you that really the sperm is the egg is the most important characteristic in terms of that determines the success. For males, in terms of sperm, even if someone has a low sperm count, when you talk about going through IVF and using ICSI, where you physically inject the sperm inside of the egg, that basically mitigates any effect of the sperm. In fact, if it had like low motility or the shape of the sperm was low morphology or anything like that. IVF laboratory is important. Cycle monitoring, we're very careful about where we have, for example, if we have an egg donor at off-site at a place that's in New York or California or where they're actually doing the monitoring, because we rely on that information. She would have her monitoring there and then would come here for the retrieval. The gestational carrier that we are careful about screening, and then the embryo transfer is an important part. Success rates basically do range in terms of different, depending on where different clinics. That the success rate for using it in our program, using a gestational carrier and egg donor, is about 75 to 80%. The twin rate is about 45% if you transfer 2 embryos, and one child is like life-changing, and so 2 babies at a time is something that you really have to consider in terms of whether you want to transferring 2 embryos. And so I think that, so typically, ideally, certainly if you've had an embryo that's been tested, PGS tested, the recommendation is transferring a single embryo, because that really makes the most sense, but it's not an absolute requirement. This is just from two patients of ours actually that spoke last night that that talked about. I mean, for me, I really have to say that luckily what we do is very exciting, and I think that the ability to help couples have children, to being able to play a part of that is like really amazing, and how it definitely. Certainly personally for me in terms of how children change your life and how you see it change the lives of others really makes the process really worthwhile. So hopefully we can help y'all, help you in this process. Questions? Yes?
We heard a little bit earlier about potential health risks. If you said the 45% chance of both embryos taking,
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering if you had any sort of insight on that. Like, what levels of risk are you talking about? What have you seen?
So I think the reason you hear it, so the risk is really the risk to the baby. It's not the risk to the mother. You know what I mean? I mean, it's really the risk to the baby, and that that when you have twins, that the uterus is built really for one child. And not to say that, I mean, you probably know there are people that have twins that have done fine. But when you start, when you have twins, and certainly when you have triplets, that the risk of preterm delivery goes up substantially. The risk of complications in pregnancy goes up, of diabetes, of gestational hypertension, just in general in terms of complications. If you were to say, if you just talk to like an OBGYN, and I'm not an OBGYN, but I just do fertility, but if you said, listen, what causes you more, which pregnancies have the more complicated issues, that keep you up at 3 in the morning? I can tell you that they would tell you twins, and then, and higher order multiples. Not to say that if you have a singleton pregnancy there are singleton pregnancies that have, there can be issues as well, but just in general. So, I always tell people that when you look at the cost of twins over 18 years compared to the cost of just doing another transfer. Let's say you decided on transferring a single embryo, and you transferred a single embryo and you weren't, and the carrier wasn't pregnant. So yes, it's disappointing, but so you transfer another embryo like a month and a half later. It's not like you know what I mean? And so you transfer another embryo a month and a half later, and so it's really is when you transfer two, you have to be ready for two. You can transfer 2 embryos and get 2, 1, or none. We don't want to get none. The goal is, a single pregnancy. And so I think that it's that's why you hear this emphasis in terms of transferring one. It's not like a requirement. It's not like that we won't take care of you that way, but we just want to make sure that you're, aware of that. And I can tell you this in terms of patients that I've had that where you transfer 2 embryos and you come back, and let's say you have 2 or 3 other embryos that are frozen, you come back and you're like, okay, how did everything go? They're like, the pregnancy, this and that, whatever, and you're like, okay, so we're going to transfer 2 more embryos, and they're like, no, what do you know what I mean? I can't even believe we transferred 2. You know what I'm saying? So it's like that. I just think that it's important to be well informed in terms of what those risks are.
I just want to elaborate on that question. So, like you say, 45% success rate for double embryo transfer. So does that mean that there's a 45% chance that both will survive and be okay, or that only one?
No, 45% chance of twins. Twins.
So what if you do 2 embryo transfers? What are the chances
No.
at least have one?
No, I'm saying I'm saying that if you transfer, you're saying so if you transfer one. So if you transfer 1 embryo, the pregnancy rate goes down about 10 to 15%, but obviously the risk of multiples goes down, 10 or 15%. So so I'm saying that when you transfer 1, that there's, the pregnancy rate goes down a little bit, but the risk of multiples goes down a lot. So
So my question was more about if you transfer 2, what are the chances that at least one of them will actually take?
well, when you're using an egg donor gestational carrier, between 70 and 80%. Okay.
So they're really the only.
Oh, you're saying when you transfer 2,
Yeah.
right? So when you transfer 1, it goes down to about 60, probably like 65%. Okay, but I'm saying so it does. The pregnancy rate obviously goes down a little bit, but the risk of multiples goes down a lot. So if you're it's just a consideration. I mean, when you think of, for example, if you have a surrogate, When you think about, you have a surrogate that's at, you transfer to and she's at bed rest 30 weeks. Well, for example, let's say she has other children, then, there's a consideration of who's paying for, for her salary while she's at bed rest. Somebody's paying that, and it could be, depending on contractually how things are worked out. It could, it could be the intended parents. So it's just it's something, important, to keep in mind. Although I also know there's also that you're kind of like, well, we'd want to be done with this the first time, and it'd be nice if we could have both of, if we inseminate the sperm and have, able to transfer an embryo from both couples, if that works out, as well. So I'm not saying that can't happen. I'm just saying that just as long as you're aware of that.
Requests with this sort of patient population that, each one of you would want to put in an embryo with your genetic makeup and your
Right.
sperm. And
Right.
that happens a lot. As
Right.
long as, we've had that conversation that you're okay with multiple.
Right. Then we do. Yeah.
Request to put an embryo from each of you.
Right. Right. We certainly do that. Other questions?
How many women do you have in your egg donor database, roughly, give or take?
25 or 30? Yeah. Believe it or not, like recruiting donors is not easy.
And we have a strict criteria. that we
Right.
have to meet.
Right. So
we
you
won't
recruit.
just let anyone in.
Right,
So
right.
That's why I feel like the numbers are.
It's kind of, we would obviously, it takes a lot in terms of recruiting people, because you're like, depending on, you just won't let anybody, in, because it's kind of like we're putting our stamp in terms of this person. So, other questions?
Other agencies that you guys are working with, surrogacy agencies?
Definitely. We can give you, obviously if you come to our table, we can certainly give you names of agencies that, that are very familiar with us and that we're familiar with them. And I think that is important when you're talking to anybody in terms of, of getting an idea of what their success rate is and how patients have typically done, because they can tell you really how, how people have done when they've gone through.
Anytime that you're